The heavy iron latch slipped from Clara's fingers. Freezing wind rushed into the cabin. A towering shadow blocked the morning sun. King Eric, the warlord who ruled the north, stood on her crumbling porch. Armed guards waited on war horses behind him. Clara retreated until her back hit the stone fireplace. Commoners rarely survived a visit from the crown. Eric stepped over the threshold. The floorboards groaned under his weight. He did not draw a sword. He simply raised his hand toward the cornered baker. Gripped in his leather glove was a ragged gray fabric. It was the exact winter coat she had wrapped around a dying beast just hours ago. But to understand how a simple baker's coat ended up in the hands of a lethal sovereign, we must return to the frozen woods. The winter storm battered the quiet village. Clara pulled her frayed collar tight against her neck. She carried a meager bundle of firewood across the snow-covered lawn. The edge of the dark woods marked the boundary of her small property. A sudden shift in the wind carried a strange sound. It was a harsh, ragged breath. Clara halted her steps. She dropped the heavy firewood into the fresh snow. A massive shadow lay motionless on the frozen grass. She took a cautious step forward. The shape slowly resolved into the form of a giant wolf. His dark coat was matted with ice. The animal struggled to draw air into his lungs. Fear screamed at Clara to run back inside. Predators rarely ventured this close to human homes. Yet something in his quiet suffering rooted her in place. "You are hurt," Clara whispered into the freezing wind. The wolf opened a single golden eye. His gaze held none of the mindless savagery she expected. An unspoken intelligence burned within that stare. Clara sank to her knees in the deep snow. The bitter cold immediately soaked through her thin dress. "I will not hurt you," she murmured. "You have nothing to fear from me." The wolf released a low warning rumble. The sound vibrated through the frozen earth beneath her boots. Clara did not pull her hand back. She reached out slowly. She rested her bare palm on his broad head. She stroked his ears gently, treating him with the same tender care one might offer a frightened dog. The dangerous rumble died instantly in his throat. He closed his eyes. He exhaled a long, shuddering breath against her wrist. Clara noticed a dark stain on the snow beneath him. It was blood. "Who did this to you?" she asked the empty night. "Who could hurt a creature like you?" The wolf did not answer. He simply watched her with those ancient eyes. Clara tore a strip of fabric from the hem of her dress. She pressed the makeshift bandage against his wound. The wolf flinched at the sudden pressure. "I am sorry," she whispered quickly. "I have to stop the bleeding." "Just hold still." He settled back into the snow with a resigned huff. Clara tied the fabric tight. Her fingers grew clumsy from the dropping temperature. The snow began to fall with renewed fury. Ice crystals gathered quickly on his dark fur. He was freezing to death right on her lawn. Clara knew she could not drag him into the cabin. Her small frame possessed no strength to move such weight. She unfastened the wooden buttons of her coat. The worn garment was her only real defense against the winter. She slipped it off her trembling shoulders. The freezing wind sliced through her cotton clothes like a blade. Clara ignored the biting chill. She draped the heavy fabric over the wolf's side. She tucked the ragged edges under his body to trap the heat. "This is all I have," she said softly. "I know it isn't much. It must be enough to get you through the night." The wolf shifted slightly under the weight of the cloth. He leaned his large head against her knee. The gesture felt gentle. Tears pricked the corners of Clara's eyes. She folded her arms tightly across her chest. She leaned her back against the trunk of a nearby oak tree. "We just have to wait for the morning," she told him. "The sun will bring warmth." The hours dragged on in bitter darkness. The cold gnawed relentlessly at her fingers. She kept one hand resting on the wolf's steady side. Feeling his chest rise and fall became her ankle in the storm. Whenever he shivered, she leaned her body closer. She shared whatever fragile warmth her skin could provide. "My name is Clara," she whispered. "I lay alone in that cabin." The wolf twitched his ear in response. "People say these woods are dangerous. Perhaps they are right. But you don't look like a monster to me." The wind howled louder. Clara rubbed her numb hands together. She blew warm air into her cupped palms. "Stay with me," Clara coaxed during the darkest hour. "Don't let the cold win." "We are too strong to surrender now." The wolf let out a quiet sigh. He shifted his weight to press firmly against her side. A strange sense of peace settled over the snowy lawn. They were simply two survivors weathering the unforgiving night. Clara hummed a quiet tune. It was an old lullaby her mother used to sing. The melody seemed to soothe the agitated beast. His breathing gradually slowed to a steady rhythm. Clara rested her chin on her knees. She watched the snowflakes land on his dark nose. They melted instantly against his warm skin. "You must be an alpha," she mused aloud. "Only a king of the woods could be this large." The wolf let out another soft rumble. Clara smiled faintly in the darkness. "Don't worry," she teased gently. "Your secret is safe with me." Clara talked to keep them both awake. "I bake bread for the village," she murmured. "I will share a loaf with you tomorrow." "You need to eat to heal." The wolf offered a faint huff of air. It sounded almost like an agreement. Exhaustion finally overpowered her fear. Clara's eyes drifted shut. The storm began to break apart. Pale light pierced through the gray clouds. Clara woke with a sharp gasp. Her limbs felt stiff and heavy from the frost. She reached out blindly for the dark fur. Her fingers met only cold air. The wolf was gone. Clara pushed herself up from the snow. She scanned the quiet lawn. A trail of large paw prints led away from the tree. They disappeared into the shadows of the dense woods. Her ragged coat lay neatly folded on the dry grass. A heavy knock suddenly echoed from the direction of her cabin door. The heavy knock shattered the morning silence. Clara jumped at the sudden noise. Her fingers released the edge of her frozen window. She wiped the condensation from the glass. She could not see the porch from this angle. Another knock struck the heavy wood. The sound carried a distinct authority. It was not the polite tapping of a neighbor. Clara smoothed her wrinkled skirt. She hurried across the uneven floorboards. She pulled the iron latch back. The cold wind rushed into her small home. Clara blinked against the sudden morning glare. A towering figure blocked the winter sun. She stopped breathing for a second. Men in dark armor stood behind him. Their war horses stamped impatiently in the deep snow. The air smelled of leather and polished steel. Clara recognized the royal crest on their shields. Fear closed around her throat like a physical grip. Everyone in the realm knew the man on her porch. King Eric ruled the northern territories with an iron hand. Whispers of his ruthlessness reached even this quiet village. Travelers claimed he once burned 3 rebel cities in a single night. They said he executed traitors without saying a word. Now this living legend stood on her crumbling steps. Eric wore a heavy cloak of spun wool. His broad shoulders easily filled the doorframe. Clara kept her gaze fixed on his polished boots. Commoners were forbidden to look upon the royal face. Her mind raced through her recent actions. She always paid her meager taxes on time. She never spoke against the crown. A royal guard stepped forward from the snow. "Bow your head, peasant," the guard barked. Eric did not turn around. He simply raised one gloved finger. The guard snapped his mouth shut instantly. The soldier stepped back into the ranks. A terrifying silence descended over the yard. Eric stepped over the threshold. The floorboards groaned under his immense weight. He filled the small cabin with a dangerous energy. Clara retreated until her back hit the stone fireplace. "Look at me," Eric commanded. His voice was a deep rumble in his chest. It sent a strange tremor down her spine. The sound felt incredibly familiar. Clara slowly raised her eyes. Eric possessed a harsh and striking face. His jawline looked as sharp as a drawn blade. A fresh scar ran along his neck. It disappeared beneath his dark collar. His eyes caught the morning light. They were a striking shade of gold. Clara gasped softly. She had seen those eyes in the dark woods. Eric held out his left hand. He gripped a bundle of ragged gray fabric. It was her worn winter coat. Clara stared at the garment in disbelief. She had left it on the grass just an hour ago. "Take it," Eric said. Clara reached out with trembling fingers. She expected the fabric to be frozen solid. Instead, the wool felt warm. It carried the faint scent of pine and rain. "Thank you, Your Grace," Clara whispered. She clutched the coat against her chest. Eric studied her face in the quiet room. His intense gaze made her skin prickle. He noticed the tear at the hem of her dress. He remembered the bandage she made in the snow. Clara swallowed hard under his scrutiny. "May I ask why the king visits my home?" she asked politely. Her voice shook despite her best efforts. Eric stepped closer. He closed the distance between them with a predator's grace. "Pack your belongings," he instructed calmly. Clara blinked in confusion. "My lord? You are leaving this village." Clara felt a sudden spike of panic. "But I cannot leave," she protested. "I have blood rising in the oven. The villagers expect my delivery by noon." It was a foolish thing to say to a ruler. Eric did not show any anger. "The village will bake their own bread today. You belong to the crown now." Clara shook her head. "I have committed no crime. I am just a simple baker." "You do not to understand," Eric replied. "You only need to obey." His tone left no room for debate. Clara looked out the open door. A black carriage waited at the end of her path. 4 draft horses stamped the frozen ground. The royal crest gleamed on the carriage door. "Where are you taking me?" Clara asked. Her fingers dug into the fabric of her coat. "To the capital," Eric answered. "To the Winter Palace." Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. The capital was a place of ruthless politics. A commoner like her would not survive a week. "Please," Clara begged softly. "I belong in the woods." Eric reached out suddenly. Clara flinched and squeezed her eyes shut. She expected a blow for her defiance. Instead, she felt a heavy warmth settle over her shoulders. Eric draped his own fur-lined cloak over her frame. The heavy garment smelled of wood smoke and power. It swallowed her small figure. Clara opened her eyes in pure shock. Eric pulled the edges of the cloak together. His gloved knuckles brushed against her collarbone. The contact sent a jolt of heat through her skin. "The woods are too cold for you," he murmured. His golden eyes softened for a fraction of a second. The dangerous warlord vanished in that brief moment. He looked exactly like a wounded creature seeking shelter. Clara lost her breath. She could not reconcile the tyrant with this gentle action. "You have 5 minutes to gather your things," Eric stated. His voice returned to a flat mask of authority. He turned his back on her. He walked out onto the wooden porch. The royal guards straightened their postures immediately. Clara stood frozen by the fireplace. She hugged the king's heavy cloak tightly around herself. She looked at her small kitchen table. She looked at the warm oven in the corner. Her simple life was ending right now. She walked into her small bedroom. She pulled a canvas bag from under the bed. She packed 2 spare dresses and a wooden comb. She opened a small wooden chest. Her hands trembled as she folded a knitted blanket. She remembered the cold nights in this cabin. She wondered if the palace would be any warmer. Clara picked up a small silver locket from the table. It contained a lock of her father's hair. She slipped it carefully into her deep pocket. She returned to the front room. Eric waited patiently by the door. He watched her carry the meager bag. He did not mock her lack of possessions. "Is that all?" he asked. "Yes, Your Grace," Clara replied. She walked out into the biting morning air. A guard stepped forward to take her bag. Eric blocked the man with his arm. He took the canvas bag from Clara himself. The guard stared at his king in obvious shock. Kings did not carry luggage for peasants. Eric ignored the silent confusion of his men. He walked down the snowy path toward the carriage. Clara followed his wide footsteps in the deep snow. The villagers had gathered at the edge of the road. They watched the procession in terrified silence. No one dared to speak a word of protest. Clara felt a profound sense of isolation. She reached the heavy wooden door of the carriage. Eric opened it smoothly. He offered his hand to help her up the steps. Clara hesitated before touching his leather glove. His grip was firm and warm. She climbed into the velvet interior of the cabin. Eric stepped in right after her. He closed the door firmly behind them. The sudden silence in the carriage was overwhelming. The vehicle lurched forward into motion. The carriage wheels crutched loudly against the packed snow. Clara kept her hands folded tightly in her lap. The king's heavy cloak still rested on her shoulders. It felt like a physical weight tying her to him. Eric watched the changing landscape through the glass. He did not offer any further explanation for this abduction. Clara gathered a small shred of courage. "My lord," she started nervously. Eric shifted his gaze away from the window. He waited in silence for her to continue. "What will become of my bakery?" she asked. "The mayor will claim the property," Eric answered. "He will sell it to the highest bidder." Clara felt a sharp pang of sorrow. "That land belonged to my family for generations." "It belongs to the crown now," he stated simply. His tone held no malice. It was simply a statement of fact. Clara looked down at her worn boots. "Why me?" she whispered into the quiet cabin. "There are 1,000 women in these territories. Why pull me from my home?" Eric leaned forward slightly. The leather at his seat creaked under the movement. "You showed kindness to a dying creature," he said softly. Clara felt her heart skip a beat. "I only helped a stray dog," she lied smoothly. Eric tilted his head to the side. A dangerous smirk touched his lips. "A dog," he repeated slowly. He tasted the word as if it amused him. "It was very large," Clara added quickly. "But it was just an animal in the snow." Eric reached across the small space between them. He caught a loose strand of her hair. He tucked it gently behind her ear. Clara froze at the intimate gesture. His leather glove felt rough against her cheek. "You are a terrible liar, Clara," he murmured. Hearing her name on his lips sent a shiver through her body. He knew her name. She'd whispered it to the wolf in the dark. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She stared into his golden eyes. The truth hung unspoken in the tense air between them. The king of the north was the beast from the woods. Eric settled back into his seat. He seemed satisfied by her silent realization. "Rest now," he ordered quietly. "The journey to the Winter Palace is long." The carriage rolled relentlessly over the frozen road. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the heavy velvet curtains. She did not dare to look across the narrow cabin. Eric sat in the opposite seat. He occupied a massive amount of space. His long legs stretched out casually toward her side. The toes of his polished boots almost touched her worn shoes. The silence in the carriage felt thicker than the winter fog. Clara listened to the rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves. Each strike pulled her further from the only home she knew. She pulled the heavy cloak tighter around her trembling shoulders. The rich fur lining retained his body heat. It offered a stark contrast to the icy terror in her veins. She stole a quick glance at the man. Eric rested his head against the dark wood of the cabin. His eyes were closed. His chest rose and fell in a slow rhythm. He looked deceptively peaceful in sleep. Clara noticed the harsh lines of his face. The fresh scar on his neck looked painful. She remembered the dark blood staining the snow. She remembered the ragged breath of the dying wolf. It was impossible to merge those two images. The beast had yielded to her gentle touch. The king commanded entire armies with a single glare. Clara squeezed her hands together in her lap. She wondered if she was riding to her own execution. Tyrants rarely let their weaknesses live. She knew his greatest secret now. She had seen him vulnerable and broken. The carriage suddenly jolted over a deep rut. Clara pitched forward from her seat. She braced herself for a harsh impact against the floor. A strong hand caught her shoulder mid-fall. Eric opened his eyes instantly. His reflexes were unnatural. He pushed her gently back into her velvet seat. "Careful," he murmured. His voice sounded rough from sleep. Clara shrank back against the cushions. "I apologize, Your Grace," she stammered quickly. Eric withdrew his hand. He frowned at her fearful reaction. He reached under his seat. He produced a small silver flask and a wrapped bundle. He placed the items on the small table between them. "Eat," he commanded quietly. Clara stared at the bundle. "I am not hungry, my lord." "You have not eaten since yesterday," Eric stated. He unwrapped the linen cloth himself. The rich scent of roasted meat and warm bread filled the cabin. It was the food of nobility. Clara felt her stomach twist with sudden hunger. "Eat," Eric repeated. His tone held a dangerous edge of authority. Clara picked up a small piece of bread with shaking fingers. She forced herself to take a bite. The soft texture tasted like a luxury she did not deserve. Eric watched her eat in silence. He picked up the silver flask. He unscrewed the heavy cap. He handed the vessel across the table. "Drink this," he instructed. "It will chase the cold from your bones." Clara took the heavy flask. The metal felt warm against her skin. She took a cautious sip. A sweet, spiced wine burned a pleasant trail down her throat. It spread a sudden warmth through her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. Eric simply nodded. He turned his gaze toward the frosted window. The dense pine trees began to thin out. Dark stone watchtowers appeared on the high ridges. They were entering the heart of the Northern Territory. The carriage passed through a massive stone archway. Armed guards lined the elevated ways. They struck their iron shields in a synchronized salute. The deafening crash echoed across the snowy valley. Clara flinched at the aggressive sound. Eric did not acknowledge the military display. He looked bored by the devotion of his army. The journey continued for another tense hour. The winter sun began its early descent. Long shadows stretched across the pale snow. The carriage finally rounded a sharp bend in the road. Clara let out a soft gasp. The winter palace loomed in the distance. It was a monstrous fortress of black stone. Tall spires pierced the gray clouds like iron spears. Thick walls formed an impenetrable ring around the inner keep. Clara felt a fresh wave of panic crash over her. She did not belong in a place of such brutal power. She was a baker who hummed to stray animals. She was going to be crushed by these stone walls. The carriage slowed as it approached the main gates. A heavy iron portcullis shrieked as it rose. The horses pulled the vehicle into a vast courtyard. Hundreds of soldiers stood in perfect formation. They wore black armor and thick fur mantles. The carriage rolled to a gentle stop. The silence in the courtyard was intense. No one spoke. No horse neighed. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. A royal footman opened the carriage door. He pulled down the wooden steps. Eric stood up from his seat. He stepped out into the freezing air. The instant his boots hit the cobblestones, a unified sound rang out. Every single soldier dropped to one knee. The crash of metal against stones shook the ground. "Hail the king!" they shouted in unison. The massive sound physically struck Clara in the chest. She sat frozen in the carriage. She stared at the sea of kneeling warriors. They revered this man like a living god. Eric did not tell them to rise. He turned back toward the open carriage door. He held out his hand. Clara stared at his leather glove. Her legs refused to move. Her lungs forgot how to pull in air. The sheer scale of his authority paralyzed her legs. Eric leaned into the carriage frame. He ignored the hundreds of men waiting in the snow. "Clara," he said softly. Only she could hear his low voice. "Take my hand." "I cannot," she breathed out in a panic. "They are all looking." "They are looking at the ground," Eric corrected her. "No one dares to look at what is mine." Clara felt a strange jolt at his possessive word. She slowly raised her trembling hand. She placed her fingers in his palm. Eric closed his strong grip around her cold skin. He pulled her gently toward the steps. Clara descended from the carriage. Her knees nearly buckled as her feet hit the stone. Eric did not let go of her hand. He offered a subtle support against her weakness. He led her up the grand stairs of the keep. The kneeling soldiers remained perfectly still. Clara kept her head bowed in terror. She felt like an imposter wearing stolen clothes. The heavy oak doors of the palace stood open. Two massive braziers burned on either side of the entrance. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. Eric stepped over the threshold. He pulled Clara into the dim interior of the fortress. The air inside smelled of beeswax and cold stone. The temperature was barely warmer than the courtyard. Eric finally released her hand. The sudden loss of his warmth left her shivering. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them. The booming sound echoed through the vaulted ceiling. It sounded like a massive lock snapping into place. Clara spun around to look at the closed doors. She was officially trapped in the king's domain. A sharp clearing of a throat echoed from the shadows. Clara turned her attention back to the hall. An older woman stepped into the flickering light. She wore a Seville gray dress and a ring of heavy keys. Her face held taut lines of disapproval. She stared at Clara with open disdain. She noted the muddy boots and the simple linen dress hiding under the royal cloak. "Your Grace," the woman addressed Eric. She offered a stiff curtsy. "You have returned." "I have, Lady Agatha," Eric replied coldly. "And you have brought a gust," Agatha noted. Her tone managed to make the word sound like an insult. Clara shrank back slightly. She felt the familiar sting of class prejudice. Eric shifted his weight. He casually placed himself between Clara and the housekeeper. It was a deliberate blocking maneuver. "She is not a guest," Eric stated flatly. Lady Agatha raised a thin eyebrow. "Then where shall I put her?" "My lord. With the scullery maids?" The housekeeper offered a cruel smile. Eric's golden eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop. He rested his hand on the hilt of his sword. "She will take the East Tower chambers," Eric commanded. Lady Agatha lost all color in her face. She gasped audibly. "But my lord," she sputtered, "those are the royal adjacent rooms. They connect directly to your private wing." Clara looked up at Eric in shock. She did not understand the palace layout. She understood the tone of absolute scandal in the woman's voice. Eric did not look at the housekeeper. He looked down at Clara. His gaze carried a silent promise of protection. "Do you question my orders in my own house?" Eric asked softly. The quiet tone was infinitely more terrifying than a shout. Lady Agatha bowed low instantly. "No, Your Grace. I will prepare the rooms at once." Agatha shot one last venomous glare at Clara before scurrying away. Clara stood alone with the king in the dark hall. The hostility of the castle was already suffocating. Eric unclasped his heavy winter cloak from his shoulders. He did not hand it to a waiting servant. He turned to Clara. "The wolves of the court have sharper teeth than the ones in the woods," Eric warned in a low murmur. Clara pulled the edges of his cloak tighter around her neck. She felt small in the cavernous room. The stone floor drained the heat from her thin soles. Tapestries of bloody battles hung on the walls. They depicted wolves tearing the throats out of stags. "I do not know how to fight them," Clara admitted quietly. Her voice trembled in the vast space. "I only know how to bake bread." Eric reached out a gloved hand. He traced the heavy velvet collar resting against her cheek. The touch was surprisingly gentle. "You do not need to fight them," he replied. "You only need to stand behind me." Clara looked up into his striking golden eyes. She saw no trace of the ruthless tyrant in this private moment. She saw only the quiet guardian from the snowy lawn. A sudden heavy footstep echoed down the corridor. A tall man in gleaming armor approached them. He possessed sharp features and cold blue eyes. Clara noticed the intricate wolf insignia pinned to his chest. He was a high-ranking commander. "My king," the man greeted with a sharp nod. He did not kneel like the common soldiers outside. Eric dropped his hand from Clara's collar instantly. His posture stiffened into rigid readiness. "Commander Thorn," Eric acknowledged flatly. Thorn shifted his cold gaze toward Clara. His eyes raked over her simple features with calculating interest. He mentally stripped away the king's heavy cloak. He saw the cheap fabric of her dress underneath. A cruel smile touched the corners of his mouth. "I see you found a stray during your hunt," Thorn mocked smoothly. "Will you keep her in the kennels?" Clara felt her face burn with deep humiliation. She lowered her eyes to the cold floor. She expected Eric to agree or dismiss her to save face. Instead, a low rumble vibrated in Eric's chest. It sounded exactly like the warning growl of the massive beast in the woods. Thorn wiped the smile from his face immediately. Eric stepped closer to the commander. The size difference between the two men became aggressively apparent. Eric towered over the other warrior. "Watch your tone, Thorn," Eric whispered. The deadly calm in his voice raised the hair on Clara's arms. "She sleeps in the East Tower." Thorn widened his eyes in genuine shock. He looked at Clara with a sudden dark suspicion. "The East Tower is for royal blood only," Thorn stated cautiously. "The East Tower is for whoever I decide to place there," Eric countered. "Do you have a problem with my architecture, Commander?" Thorn clenched his jaw tightly. "No, my king." "Then return to your post," Eric ordered. Thorn offered a stiff bow. He turned on his heel and marched down the dark corridor. His metal boots echoed ominously against the stone. Clara watched him disappear into the shadows. She realized this palace was a nest of vapors. Eric turned his attention back to her. The dangerous aura faded from his shoulders. "Come," Eric said softly. "You need a fire and a warm bath." Clara followed him deeper into the dark fortress. She did not know the rules of this new world. She only knew the king was breaking them all for her. They reached the bottom of a spiraling stone staircase. The steps climbed upward into deep darkness. A sudden chill swept down from the high tower. Clara hesitated at the first step. Eric paused and looked back at her. He did not rush her fear. He simply waited in the shadows. A low howl echoed from the distant mountains outside. Clara shivered and stepped onto the stairs. She was climbing directly into the monster's den. Clara reached the top of the spiral staircase. Her lungs burned from the long climb. Eric pushed a heavy door open with one hand. A wave of intense heat washed over Clara's cold face. The chamber offered a stark contrast to the freezing castle. A roaring fire blazed in the stone hearth. Thick rugs covered the stone floor. They absorbed the sound of their footsteps. The room smelled of dried lavender and burning pine. Clara stood awkwardly near the entrance. She did not want to track snow onto the clean rugs. Eric stepped into the center of the room. He unbuckled his sword belt. He placed a heavy weapon on a wooden table. The metallic clink sounded loud in the quiet chamber. "A maid will bring you hot water," Eric said. He did not look at her as he spoke. He rolled his tense shoulders to ease the stiffness. "You will find clean clothes in the wardrobe." Clara clutched her small canvas bag against her chest. "This room is too grand for me, my lord." "It is a room," Eric corrected flatly. "It has walls and a bed. Do not assign foolish value to simple wood and stone." His practical logic left no room for argument. Eric walked toward a side door. He paused before turning the iron handle. "Eat whatever the kitchen sends. Lock the main door after I leave. Do not let anyone inside unless you know their voice." The sudden instructions sent a tremor of fear through her. The Winter Palace was not a safe sanctuary. It was a beautiful cage filled with hidden threats. Eric stepped through the side door. It connected directly to his private quarters. The heavy wood clicked shut behind him. Clara released a long breath she had been holding. The silence of the room wrapped around her. A timid knock sounded at the main door 10 minutes later. Clara jumped at the sudden noise. She remembered Eric's strict warning. "Who is it?" she asked cautiously. "Mary, miss," a trembling voice replied. "I brought the hot water." Clara opened the heavy door. A young girl stood in the corridor. She carried 2 heavy buckets of steaming water. Mary kept her eyes glued to the floorboards. She looked terrified to simply exist in this tower. Clara hurried forward to take one of the buckets. Mary gasped and pulled the bucket back. "No, miss," the maid whispered in horror. "The king will have my head if you do servant's work." Clara froze in surprise. She was a servant in her own village. She baked bread and scrubbed floors every day. "I am just Clara," she tried to explain softly. "I am not a noble lady." Mary shook her head stubbornly. She carried the water into the adjoining bathing room. She poured the steaming liquid into a copper tub. "You sleep in the East Tower?" Mary murmured. "That makes you untouchable, miss." The maid did not wait for further conversation. She bowed deeply and hurried out of the room. Clara listened to the lock click into place. She walked into the bathing room. The hot water felt like a miraculous luxury. She scrubbed the freezing dirt from her tired skin. The warmth slowly chased the frost from her bones. She found a simple linen dress in the wooden wardrobe. It lacked the heavy embroidery of noble garments. The fabric felt incredibly soft against her skin. Clara sat in a plush chair by the fire. She tried to untangle her wet hair with her wooden comb. The side door suddenly clicked open. Clara stood up instantly. Eric stepped into the warm chamber. He had removed his dark armor. He wore a simple black tunic and loose trousers. The casual clothing made him look larger somehow. His wet hair fell across his sharp forehead. He carried a silver tray laden with roasted meat and vegetables. Clara stared at the tray in shock. A king did not carry food for a commoner. He set the tray on a small table near the fire. Clara remembered the rules of the court. She remembered the soldiers kneeling in the snow. She remembered Agatha's mocking words about her status. Clara stepped back and lowered herself toward the floor. She intended to offer a proper bow of reverence. Eric crossed the room in 2 long strides. He caught her elbows before her knees could touch the rug. His grip was firm but strangely careful. He pulled her back up to a standing position. "What are you doing?" Eric asked quietly. His golden eyes searched her face. "Showing proper respect, Your Grace," Clara whispered. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. His physical proximity overwhelmed her senses. Eric did not release her elbows immediately. His thumbs brushed lightly against her linen sleeves. "You will not kneel to me," he commanded. His voice held a low tremor of raw emotion. Clara looked up in confusion. "But the entire castle kneels to you. The council bows when you speak." "They kneel out of fear," Eric stated bluntly. "I do not want your fear." He dropped his hands from her arms. The loss of contact felt suddenly hollow. He gestured toward the chair opposite the fire. "Sit," he instructed. Clara obeyed the quiet command. Eric sat in the chair across from her. The firelight cast sharp shadows across his face. He pulled the silver trail closer between them. He drew a hunting knife from his boot. Clara watched him with wide eyes. Eric did not use the blade for violence. He carefully sliced the roasted meat into small portions. He pushed the ceramic plate toward her side of the table. He poured 2 cups of clear water. He did not call for a servant to perform these tasks. He served her with deliberate focus. "Eat," Eric said. Clara picked up a silver fork. Her fingers felt clumsy holding the expensive metal. She took a small bite of the tender meat. The silence stretched between them for several minutes. It was not the tense silence of the carriage. It felt like a fragile peace. "Why are there no servants in this tower?" Clara asked softly. She risked the question to break the quiet. "I do not like strangers near my door," Eric replied. He took a slow drink from his cup. Assassins often wear the clothes of servants. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "Are you in danger here?" "A king is always in danger," he stated casually. He spoke about death like it was the weather. "That is why you are in this tower. My guards patrol the bottom of the stairs. No one can reach this floor without my permission." Clara looked at the door leading to his room. "You gave me the room next to yours." "Yes." He offered no further explanation. He did not need to justify his actions to anyone. Clara watched the flames dance in the hearth. "I am terrified," she confessed quietly. She did not know why she admitted her weakness to a warlord. Eric set his cup down on the table. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. He closed the physical distance between them. "I know," Eric murmured. His voice was a soothing rumble in the quiet room. "You are a rabbit trapped in a den of wolves. They will try to frighten you. They will use cruel words to break your spirit." Clara swallowed the lump in her throat. Lady Agatha already tried. "Agatha is a bitter old fool," Eric said flatly. "She holds no real power over you." He reached across the small table. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. He placed his large hand over her trembling fingers. His skin felt rough and scarred. It carried a reassuring heat. "Listen to me, Clara," he said firmly. She looked up into his striking golden eyes. "You answer to no one in this castle but me. You do not bow to the council. You do not move out of the way for the commanders. If anyone speaks a word of disrespect to you, you will tell me." Clara felt a strange tightness in her chest. No one had ever protected her like this. Her father died when she was a child. She had spent her life shrinking away from trouble. now the most dangerous man in the realm, offered her a shield. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Her voice cracked slightly. "I am just a baker." Eric looked down at their joined hands. He traced the delicate bones of her knuckles. He remembered the freezing snow of the previous night. He remembered her shivering body pressing against his fur. "You are the only person who looked at a monster and saw a wounded creature," Eric replied softly. He did not say the word wolf. He did not explicitly confirm his dual nature. The hidden truth anchored them together in the quiet room. Eric pulled his hand back slowly. He stood up from his chair. He seemed to regret revealing so much emotion. "Lock the door, Clara," he reminded her. He walked toward his private chamber. "Good night, Your Grace," she called out softly. Eric paused with his hand on the iron latch. "Eric," he corrected without looking back. "When we are alone, you will call me Eric." He stepped through the door and closed it firmly. Clara sat alone by the dying fire. Her heart raced with a confusing mix of fear and warmth. She walked over to the heavy main door. She slid the iron bolt into place with a loud clank. She climbed into the large canopy bed. The feather mattress swallowed her exhausted body. Sleep claimed her quicker despite her racing thoughts. The castle grew deadly silent in the deep hours of the night. Clara woke suddenly to a strange sound. It was not a human footstep. It sounded like heavy claws scratching against stone. The noise came from the adjoining room. Clara sat up in the darkness. She pulled the thick blanket to her chin. A low groan of pain echoed through the thick wall. It was Eric's voice. Clara threw the covers off her legs. She stepped onto the cold floor with bare feet. She walked slowly toward the side door. She pressed her ear against the rough wood. Another ragged breath sounded from the other side. It sounded exactly like the dying beast in the snow. Clara reached for the iron handle. Clara's hand trembled on the cold iron handle. She pushed the heavy door open. The metal hinges protested with a faint whine. She stepped over the stone threshold. The king's private chamber was shrouded in heavy shadows. Only a single candle burned on a bedside table. The flickering light cast long shapes against the tapestries. The air smelled sharply of medicinal herbs and copper. A massive bed stood in the center of the room. Eric sat on the edge of the mattress. His broad back faced the open door. He had stripped off his dark tunic. His short hair clung damply to his sweaty neck. His muscles bunched tight with obvious pain. Clara forgot how to breathe. Her eyes locked onto his right shoulder. A ragged scar tore across his pale skin. The angry red lines looked painfully fresh. It was a brutal wound from a massive claw. The shape perfectly matched the injury she had seen in the snowy woods. She remembered wrapping her torn dress around that exact spot. Clara let out a small gasp. The sound echoed loudly in the quiet room. Eric stiffened instantly. His right hand twitched toward a hunting knife on the mattress. He relaxed slightly upon recognizing her scent. He did not turn around to face her. "You should be asleep in your bed," Eric murmured. His voice sounded hollow and tight. Clara did not retreat into her room. She took a slow step forward into his sanctuary. Her bare feet made no sound on the thick rugs. "You are bleeding again," she stated softly. A dark drop ran down his scarred back. Eric let out a slow breath. "It is a minor scrape from a training yard." He attempted to dismiss her concern with a weak lie. Clara stopped a few feet away from him. "I bound that exact wound in the snow," she challenged quietly. "I held my coat over that shoulder." The silence stretched between them for a long minute. Eric finally dropped his chin toward his chest. He surrendered to her gentle observation. The court physician left bandages on the table, Eric said. He did not issue a command. It sounded like a quiet plea. Clara moved toward the small wooden table. She found a ceramic basin of clean water and folded linen. She dipped a soft cloth into the cool water. She wrung out the excess moisture. Clara approached his back with cautious steps. "This might sting," she warned softly. "I have endured worse," Eric replied. Clara pressed the damp cloth against the angry red flesh. Eric let out a sharp hiss through his teeth. His massive frame trembled under her delicate touch. The ruler of the Northern Territories sat perfectly still for a commoner. Clara wiped the fresh blood away with careful strokes. Her heart ached at the sight of his suffering. "How did this happen?" she asked. She focused her eyes on her task. Eric remained silent for a moment. He seemed to weigh the danger of his next words. "Assassins ambushed my carriage 3 days ago," he finally explained. "They possessed weapons forged from poisoned silver. Silver slows the healing process of my kind." He offered the truth without hiding behind noble pride. Clara rinsed the bloodied cloth in the basin. "Could your guards not protect you?" "I was traveling without my royal guard," Eric admitted. "I thought I could outrun their trap. I had to shift forms to survive the ambush." He spoke of his animal nature with a heavy shame. Many commoners considered the wolf shifters to be unnatural demons. Clara squeezed the cloth tight. She felt no fear regarding his secret identity. She only felt a profound relief that he had survived. "Silver burns the beast from the inside out," Eric murmured. "It poisons the blood and clouds the mind. I wandered in the storm for 2 days. I was losing my humanity to the pain." Clara listened with a heavy heart. "Why did they attack you?" she asked. "Power always attracts knives in the dark," he answered simply. "The southern lords fear my expansion. They would rather see the realm burn than kneel to a wolf." Clara finished cleaning the dried blood. She admired the raw power in his shoulders. His skin was marked with older, faded scars. Each silver line told a story of brutal survival. He was a living map of warfare. She reached for a roll of clean linen. She stepped closer to his side. She needed to wrap the bandage around his broad chest. "I have to reach around you," Clara instructed nervously. Eric lifted his arms in silent compliance. Clara leaned forward. Her soft linen dress brushed against his bare side. She passed the bandage across his chest. Her face was inches away from his neck. She could feel the radiating heat of his feverish skin. She smelled the intoxicating scent of pine and rain. Eric turned his head slightly. His breath ghosted across her cheek. Clara froze in her awkward position. She looked up into his striking face. His golden eyes tracked her every movement. They held a dangerous intensity. It was the gaze of a predator studying a fragile prey. Clara did not look away. She finished pulling the bandage tight. She tied a small knot over his uninjured shoulder. "There," she breathed out. She tried to step back into the shadows. Eric caught her wrist with lightning speed. His grip was gentle but unbreakable. Clara gasped at the sudden restraint. Eric pulled her gently back toward the bed. He turned his body to face her directly. He looked up from his seated position. The angle stripped away his imposing height. He looked like a tired man seeking absolution. "Why do you not run from me?" Eric asked. His thumb drew a slow circle on her pulse point. You know what I am now. You know the monster hiding under the crown. Clara looked down at their joined hands. She saw the lethal strength in his scarred fingers. She remembered the terrifying roar of his army in the courtyard. I know no king who carries his own luggage, Clara replied simply. I know a wolf who let mo pet his ears. A raw emotion flickered across Eric's face. He closed his eyes against a sudden wave of vulnerability. He brought her small hand up to his face. He pressed his warm forehead against her knuckles. The gesture held an overwhelming sense of devotion. It was a physical surrender of his absolute authority. Clara felt a warm tear slide across her skin. The ruthless warlord was crying in the dark. She gently freed her fingers from his grip. Eric tensed at the loss of contact. Clara moved her hands to frame his sharp jaw. She lifted his face into the dim light. She brushed a stray lock of short hair from his brow. You are safe here, she whispered into the quiet room. She offered him the same comfort he had offered her. Eric leaned his cheek into her palm. He let out a long sigh. The heavy burden of his crown seemed to lift for a brief moment. You possess a dangerous kind of magic, Clara, he whispered. I have no magic, she denied softly. I am just a commoner. You make a monster feel like a man, he corrected. That is the rarest magic in this world. Clara felt a blush rise to her cheeks. They remained in that quiet embrace for a long time. The castle around them slept in frozen ignorance. Clara felt the steady beat of his heart under the bandage. It matched the frantic rhythm of her own pulse. She knew she was crossing a dangerous line. A commoner could never stand beside a sovereign. The vicious court would tear her apart for this intimacy. Yet, she could not walk away from his quiet suffering. Eric finally opened his eyes. The golden irises glowed warmly in the candlelight. You must return to your bed, he urged gently. The guards changed their patrol at the first light. No one can know you are in my chambers. Clara nodded in silent agreement. She dropped her hands from his face. The cold air rushed back to chill her skin. She walked backward toward the connecting door. Will you heal now? She asked anxiously. Eric offered a small, tired smile. The silver will leave my blood by tomorrow. Your bandage will speed the process. Clara gripped the iron handle of her door. Good night, Eric, she murmured. Hearing his name in the dark felt like a secret spell. Good night, Clara, Eric replied softly. She pulled the door shut between them. She leaned her back against the heavy wood. Her knees felt weak. She pressed her hands over her racing heart. The baker was tying her fate to a dangerous king. She walked slowly toward her own bed. A sudden noise broke the silence of her chamber. It was a dull thud against the thick glass. Clara froze in the center of the room. She turned her head toward the balcony window. The east tower suspended hundreds of feet above the ground. No one could possibly climb the sheer stone wall. A dark shadow shifted behind the frosted glass. A gloved hand wiped the ice from the outside pane. Clara covered her mouth to stifle a scream. A gloved hand wiped the ice from the outside pane. Clara took a stumbling step backward in the dark room. The heavy latch on the balcony window clicked open. A figure clad in dark leather forced the glass apart. A blast of freezing wind swept into the warm chamber. The winter storm quickly extinguished the bedside candles. The intruder held a gleaming silver blade. Clara opened her mouth to scream for help. The connecting door to the king's chamber exploded off its hinges. The splintered wood crashed violently against the stone wall. Eric crossed the room in a dark blur of motion. He did not carry a sword or a shield. His raw physical power was a weapon itself. He grabbed the assassin by the leather tunic. He lifted the grown man off the floor with one arm. The intruder struck blindly at Eric's chest with the dagger. Eric caught the descending wrist in midair. A loud snap of bone echoed in the quiet room. The silver blade clattered harmlessly against the stone floor. Eric did not roar or shout in anger. His cold silence was far more terrifying than any battle cry. He hurled the broken man back through the open window. The assassin disappeared into the howling storm below. A distant thud sounded against the courtyard stones moments later. Eric grabbed the brass handles of the window. He slammed the heavy doors shut against the wind. He slid the iron locking bolt firmly into place. The violent encounter lasted less than 10 seconds. Clara collapsed onto her knees on the thick rug. Her lungs burned as she gasped for air. Eric turned away from the frosted glass. He dropped to his knees beside her trembling form. He ignored his own bleeding shoulder to pull her close. He tucked her head gently against his uninjured chest. "You are safe," Eric whispered into her hair. "The threat is gone." Clara buried her wet face in his warm tunic. She clung to his broad shoulders like a lifeline in a storm. Eric held her tight until her violent shiverings stopped. He carried her carefully back to the large bed. He did not leave her side for the rest of the night. He sat awake in the wooden chair while she slept. The morning sun eventually broke through the winter clouds. Clara woke to find the chair empty. A new gown lay folded across the foot of her bed. It was a beautiful garment made of crimson velvet. The deep color rivaled the finest royal banners. Mary entered the room a moment later carrying fresh water. The young maid seemed oblivious to the midnight attack. Eric kept the violent secrets of his castle well hidden. Mary helped Clara dress in the heavy gown. She brushed Clara's long hair into an elegant knot. "The king requests your presence in the great hall," Mary announced quietly. Clara walked down the spiral staircase with a heavy heart. The rich fabric wrestled stiflingly against the stone steps. The vast corridors of the palace bustled with early activity. Noble lords and wealthy ladies gathered in small groups. They watched Clara walk past with open hostility. Cruel whispers followed her like a toxic shadow. Clara kept her chin raised despite her internal terror. She reached the arched entrance of the great hall. Commander Thorne stood near the carved doors. Lady Abatha stood beside him holding a silver tray. Thorne shifted his stance to block Clara's path. His armored arm barred her entry to the hall. "The baker emerges from her tower," Thorne sneered loudly. His cold blue eyes mocked her elegant dress. "Did you steal that velvet from the royal treasury?" Lady Agatha laughed behind her wrinkled hand. "Fine cloth cannot hide the smell of cheap flour," the housekeeper added. "She is a walking insult to the noble ladies of this court." Several nearby nobles snickered at the cruel jest. Clara felt her cheeks burn with a hot shame. She wished the stone floor would simply swallow her whole. She tried to step around the arrogant commander. Thorne moved quickly to block her again. "You do not belong here, little rabbit," Thorne warned in a low voice. "The king will soon tire of his wild stray. You will find yourself back in the snow before winter ends." A sudden drop in the corridor's temperature silenced the crowd. The ambient noise of the court died instantly. Clara felt a familiar heavy energy flood the space. Eric stood at the top of the grand staircase. He wore a black formal tunic adorned with a silver crest. His golden eyes locked onto Commander Thorne. The king did not rush down the marble steps. He descended with a slow, calculated grace. Each heavy footfall sounded like a death knell in the quiet room. The surrounding nobles scrambled to kneel on the cold stones. They bowed their heads in silent submission to their ruler. Thorne dropped to one knee with visible reluctance. Lady Agatha sank to the floor with shaking legs. Clara remained standing alone in the center of the corridor. Eric walked past the kneeling lords without a single glance. He stopped directly in front of the kneeling commander. The air around them crackled with an unseen tension. "Repeat your words, Thorne," Eric commanded softly. The dangerous whisper carried to every corner of the hall. Thorne kept his eyes hexed firmly on the floorboards. "I meant no disrespect to the crown, my king," the commander lied smoothly. Eric rested his right hand on the hilt of his sword. "You question my judgment in my own home. You insult the woman under my direct protection." Eric leaned down slightly over the armored man. "Your tongue grows too bold for a minor soldier." Thorne did not dare to answer the challenge. The commander finally realized the grave depth of his miscalculation. Eric turned his cold gaze toward the trembling housekeeper. "Pack your belongings immediately, Agatha," the king stated flatly. "You are permanently dismissed from the Winter Palace." The old woman gasped in pure terror. "Your Grace, I have served this noble house for 30 years. Your service ended today," Eric replied without a drop of mercy. He dismissed her pleading face with a slight flick of his list. Eric jerked his attention back to Thorne. "If you ever block her path again, I will remove your legs." The brutal promise hung heavy in the stale air. Everyone present knew it was not an idle threat. Eric finally looked away from his silent enemies. He turned his face toward Clara. The deadly ice in his eyes vanished in an instant. He offered her his right arm with a courteous bow. Clara placed her trembling hand lightly on his dark sleeve. He escorted her into the great hall, past the silent crowd. He seated her at his right side during the morning meal. He claimed her status before the entire watching court. The tense day slowly faded into a quiet winter evening. Clara sat in her private chamber, staring into the hearth. The dramatic events of the morning had exhausted her emotional reserves. The side door opened with a familiar soft click. Eric stepped into the warm, firelit room. He carried a heavy iron poker to stir the dying logs. He arranged the burning wood to build a stronger fire. He set the metal tool aside. He sat down on the thick rug near her chair. Clara slipped off her velvet cushion to join him on the floor. The intense heat from the hearth washed over their faces. "You did not have to banish Agatha for me," Clara murmured into the quiet space. Eric watched the dancing orange flames for a long moment. "I banished her for defying my will," he answered stubbornly. "But you protected me in front of the law," she insisted softly. Eric turned his head to look at her directly. His golden irises reflected the warm firelight. "I will always protect you, Clara." He reached out slowly with his left hand. He gently cupped the side of her soft face. His calloused thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. The simple touch sent a sudden jolt of heat through her veins. Clara did not pull away from his rough hand. She leaned into his broad palm with a soft sigh. The invisible barrier between commoner and king shattered into dust. Eric shifted his large body closer across the thick rug. He wrapped his other arm securely around her narrow waist. He pulled her gently against his solid chest. Clara rested her small hands on his broad shoulders. She felt the steady, calming rhythm of his heart beneath the tunic. Eric lowered his head slowly toward her face. He gave her ample time to pull away from the embrace. Clara tilted her chin upward to meet him halfway. He pressed his warm lips against her forehead first. It was a gentle gesture of profound reverence. He trailed a soft kiss down to her trembling eyelid. The tender contact melted the last of her lingering fears. He finally brushed his lips against her own. The kiss was careful and incredibly soft. It held none of the violent claiming she expected from a legendary warlord. He tasted like spiced wine and wild winter magic. Clara tangled her fingers into his short, dark hair. She answered his kiss with a desperate, aching honesty. They explored the new intimacy and the quiet safety of the room. They pulled apart slowly to catch their breath. Eric rested his warm forehead against hers. He closed his eyes in a rare moment of quiet contentment. A sudden frantic knock hammered on the main door. "My king!" a muffled voice yelled from the corridor. "The northern watchtowers are burning!" The frantic shout from the corridor shattered the quiet intimacy of the room. Eric pulled away from Clara instantly. His golden eyes hardened back into a predatory glare. He marched toward the heavy door. He threw the iron bolt back with a sharp crack. A breathless messenger stood in the dark hall. "The southern lords have marched on the river border," the messenger reported. "They set the warning beacons ablaze 10 minutes ago." Eric clenched his jaw tight. He turned back to face Clara. The tender lover from the hearth vanished completely into the shadows. He was the ruthless warlord once again. "I must ride out tonight," Eric stated firmly. "I will crush this rebellion before it crosses the ice." Clara stood up from the thick rug. Her hands trembled at the sudden violent shift in their reality. "Will you be safe?" she asked quietly. Eric walked back to the wooden table. He strapped his heavy sword belt across his waist. "I have fought these cowards for 10 years, he replied. "They cannot defeat me on an open field." He crossed the room to stand before her. He took her soft face in his large hands. "I am moving you to the inner keep," he instructed. "It is a windowless vault made of solid iron. 10 of my best guards will stand outside the single door. You will not open it for anyone but me." Clara nodded in silent agreement. Fear pooled heavily in her stomach. Eric kissed her forehead one last time. He turned and led her down the stone corridor. The Winter Palace was awake with frantic energy. Soldiers shouted harsh orders across the busy courtyards. Armor clanked loudly against the stone walls. Eric guided her deep into the center of the fortress. They reached a heavy vault door. 10 royal guards wearing steel plate armor saluted their king. Eric ushered Clara into the circular room. The space held only a simple cot and a burning torch. "Wait for me," Eric murmured. "I will return by tomorrow night." He pulled the iron door shut. The locking mechanism engaged with a terrifying echo. Clara was alone in the safest room in the realm. She sat on the edge of the stiff cot. She listened to the faint sounds of the army departing. The heavy portcullis shrieked as it fell shut. A strange silence descended over the ancient castle. Hours dragged on in the windowless vault. The burning torch cast dancing shadows on the metal walls. Clara rubbed her bare arms to generate warmth. The thick iron blacked out the howling storm. It also blocked out any sound of the palace above. She felt like a ghost trapped in a forgotten tomb. She replayed Eric's gentle kiss in her mind to stay calm. She traced her lips with her trembling fingers. The memory offered a fragile comfort. She knew she was the softest target in this brutal war. The rebels could not defeat the immortal king in battle. They would try to strike at his newly discovered heart. A sudden thud vibrated through the metal door. Clara froze on the edge of her cot. It sounded like a heavy sack hitting the floor. A second thud followed immediately. Then came the distinct scraping of metal against stone. Clara stood up slowly. She backed away, and her shoulders hit the cold wall.
"Who's there?" she called out nervously. No one answered from the corridor. The 10 royal guards should have announced any visitor. They were suspiciously silent. Clara heard a liquid dripping sound outside the heavy door. Fear closed a tight grip around her throat. The iron lock clicked sharply. Someone possessed the key to the royal vault. The door swung open on silent hinges. Commander Thorne stood in the dark archway. He wore his formal silver armor. His drawn sword dripped with dark blood. The bodies of Eric's elite guards lay scattered across the corridor. Thorne had slaughtered his own men. Claire let out a muffled gasp of horror. Thorne stepped into the torchlit vault. He wiped his bloody blade with a linen cloth. 2 rebel soldiers followed closely behind him. "I told you the king would tire of you, Baker." Thorne smiled cruelly. "I just accelerated the process." Clara pressed her back harder against the iron wall. "You are committing treason," she whispered. Thorne laughed a cold, hollow sound. "Treason is just a word used by the losing side. The Southern Lords pay well in gold. They also promised me command of the Northern Army." He took a slow step toward her. "They only ask for one simple favor in return. They wanted the head of the king." Clara lifted her chin defiantly. "He will crush your pathetic rebellion before sunrise." "You cannot kill a monster with conventional steel." Thorne smiled wider at her defense of the king. "You are quite right, Clara. A wolf in his prime is invincible on the battlefield. He fights without fear because he has nothing to lose." Thorne paused to let the words sink in. But a wolf protecting his mate is a different creature. He becomes reckless. He abandons strategy to rush toward her prey. He exposes his own neck to save hers. Clara felt a sickening drop in her stomach. The border attack was a calculated diversion. They wanted to pull Eric away from the castle. They wanted to leave his human weakness unprotected. "You are the bait," Thorne stated bluntly. "We are going to drag you out into the freezing courtyard. They are going to tie you to a wooden stake. And we will send a messenger bird to the king." Thorne raised his blood-stained sword. "He will run back here alone in a blind panic. He will run right into our silver nets." Clara realized the fatal depth of her situation. Her presence in his life had doomed the invincible king. She could not allow them to use her against him. She scanned the small room for a weapon. She only saw the heavy twitch it mounted on the wall. Clara lunged forward with sudden desperate speed. She grabbed the burning wood from its iron bracket. She swung the flaming torch toward Theron's face. The commander cursed and raised his armored arm. The fire scorched his leather glove. Sparks shired across the metal floor. Clara darted past his bulky frame toward the open door. She slipped into a flow of fresh blood in the corridor. Her knees slammed hard against the stone floor. She lost her grip on the wooden torch. The 2 rebel soldiers pounced on her instantly. They grabbed her arms with brutal force. They hauled her roughly to her feet. Clara kicked and thrashed against their heavy grip. Her soft velvet gown tore at the shoulder. Thorne walked slowly out of the vault. He inspected the burn mark on his leather glove. His blue eyes burned with a vicious anger. "You possess more spirit than a common baker," he hissed. He stepped close and struck her face with a heavy backhand. The force of the blow snapped her head to the side. Clara tasted hot copper in her mouth. Her vision blurred for a dizzying moment. "Drag her to the center courtyard," Thorne ordered his men. "Prepare the iron chains." The soldiers dragged Clara through the empty palace corridors. The remaining loyal servants had locked themselves in the cellars. Thorne's traitorous faction controlled the entire keep. The brutal cold hit Clara like a physical wall as they exited the castle. The winter storm raged violently across the open courtyard. The snow fell in thick, blinding sheets. A heavy post stood in the center of the cobblestones. Heavy iron chains hung from a metal ring. The soldiers shoved Clara hard against the rough wood. They wrapped the freezing chains around her waist. They pulled the metal links tight against her ribs. Clara gasped as the iron bit into her delicate skin. She shivered violently in the torn velvet dress. Thorn stood a few feet away, wrapping a fur cloak around himself. He watched her suffer with casual indifference. Dozens of rebel archers lined the high stone walls. They hid arrows tipped with deadly silver. The trap was set perfectly for a desperate wolf. Clara tilted her bleeding face toward the dark sky. She prayed silently into the howling wind. She did not pray for her own rescue.
She prayed that Eric would ignore the messenger bird. She prayed the warlord would choose victory over a commoner. A heavy silence suddenly fell over the snowy courtyard. The wind stopped howling for one unnatural second. Thorn frowned and looked toward the main gates. The rebel archers shifted nervously on the walls. A sound pierced the freezing night air. It was not a human horn or a battle cry. It was a deafening roar of absolute fury. The monstrous howl echoed off the surrounding mountains. It sounded incredibly close. The heavy iron portcullis began to shudder violently in its track. The heavy portcullis shuddered in its stone track. A massive force struck the ancient metal from the outside. The deafening crash drowned out the howling storm. Thorn took a nervous step backward in the snow. He raised his sword toward the shaking gate. The iron hinges screamed under a second impact. Thick oak beams splintered into jagged fragments. The center of the portcullis buckled inward. A third strike tore the heavy gate from its anchors. The broken metal crashed onto the snowy cobblestones. A cloud of white powder erupted into the freezing air. Silence fell over the terrified soldiers. Eric walked through the settling snow. He did not bring his loyal army. He did not wear his dark armor. He stood alone in the biting wind. His chest heaved with ragged breaths. He had ridden his horse to death to reach her. He had run the final miles on his own feet. His golden eyes locked instantly onto the wooden post. He saw the iron chains digging into Clara's waist. He saw the dark bruise blooming on her pale cheek. A terrifying stillness settled over the king. It was the calm before a devastating disaster. The ambient temperature in the courtyard seemed to drop further. His lethal aura radiated across the open space. It pressed against the chests of the rebel soldiers like a physical weight. Several men drafted at bows with trembling hands. "Fire the arrows!" Thorn screamed in sudden panic. "He is only one man!" The archers on the wall hesitated for a fatal second. Eric did not draw his sword. He dropped to his hands and knees in the deep snow. A dark shadow erupted from his spine. The physical transformation happened in a fluid blur of motion. There was no gruesome sound of breaking bones. There was only a sudden explosion of raw power. The human king vanished into the winter storm. A giant wolf stood in his place. He was larger than any normal beast of the forest. His thick fur absorbed the faint moonlight. His golden eyes burned with a lethal promise. Clara gasped at the majestic sight of him. He was the exact creature she had sheltered in the woods. He looked infinitely more dangerous without his injuries. The wolf let out a bone-rattling roar. The sound shattered the courage of the remaining archers. Silver arrows rained down from the high walls. The wolf moved with impossible speed. He became a dark phantom weaving through the falling snow. The deadly shafts struck only empty cobblestones. He closed the distance to the rebel line in 3 bounds. He did not tear into their flesh with his teeth. He simply used his immense momentum. He slammed into the front row of armored men. The impact threw 5 soldiers across the courtyard. They landed unconscious in the deep snowdrifts. The remaining rebels broke their defensive formation instantly. They abandoned their commander and ran for the broken gates. They realized they were hunting a living god. Thorn stood alone near the center of the courtyard. His grand rebellion dissolved into pathetic fear. He raised his silver sword with a shaking grip. The giant wolf circled him with predatory grace. Each heavy paw made no sound on the packed snow. Thorn swung his blade in a desperate arc. The wolf dodged the clumsy attack effortlessly. He lunged forward and clamped his jaws around Thorn's wrist. He did not bite through the delicate skin. He merely applied enough pressure to crush the metal gauntlet. Thorn screamed as his sword fell to the ground. The wolf pinned the commander to the freezing earth. He pressed one giant paw against Thorn's chest. The sheer weight paralyzed the treacherous soldier. The wolf leaned down until his dark snout touched Thorn's face. He let out a low growl. Thorn sobbed openly in pure terror. He wept like a frightened child. The wolf deemed him unworthy of a violent death. He stepped off the broken man and turned away.
The courtyard was now empty of any threats. Only the chained baker and the beast remained. The wolf turned his golden eyes toward the wooden post. The dangerous aura faded from his broad shoulders. He walked slowly toward Clara. He lowered his massive head in a submissive posture. He did not want to frighten her with his imposing size. Clara watched him approach through her falling tears. She felt no fear of the wild predator. She only saw the lonely king who rushed home to save her. The wolf stopped inches away from her bound body. He sniffed the cold chains wrapping her waist. He opened his massive jaws. He clamped his sharp teeth over the metal links. He pulled his heavy neck backward with a sharp jerk. The iron chain snapped with a loud crack. The heavy bindings fell uselessly to the snowy ground. Clara lost her primary support. Her numb legs folded beneath her weight. She did not hit the cold cobblestones. The wolf stepped forward and caught her against his thick chest. His dense fur radiated a massive amount of heat. It felt exactly like the warmth he shared in the forest. Clara buried her freezing hands in his dark coat. She buried her bruised face against his warm neck. The wolf let out a soft whine. He nudged her shoulder gently with his wet nose. He was checking her for any serious injuries. Clara wrapped her arms weakly around his broad head. "You came back," she whispered into his fur. The wolf closed his golden eyes in silent relief. He rested his heavy chin on top of her head. He shielded her small body from the biting wind. The ruthless warlord became a gentle guardian once again. He ignored the burning watchtowers in the distant mountains. He ignored the political ruin of his winter court. He only cared about the fragile woman in his arms. The howling storm seemed to call around them. The snow fell in soft flakes. Clara pressed a kiss against his dark ear. She offered the same tender gesture from their first night. The wolf relaxed his tense muscles. He surrendered his feral nature to her gentle touch. He lay down carefully on the snowy ground. He curled his massive body around her shivering form. He created a perfect shelter of fur and body heat. Claire leaned back against his steady chest. She watched his slow breathing form small clouds in the air. "I am safe now," she told the quiet night. The beast offered a low rumble of agreement. He would never let another soul threaten her peace. They waited together in the snowy courtyard. The king and his baker needed no words to understand each other. The broken chains lay forgotten in the snow. The dangerous court held no more power over her fate. She had tamed the legendary monster with simple kindness. He had offered his kingdom in return for her warmth. A pale light began to break over the eastern horizon.
Dawn chased the long night away from the winter palace. Clara stroked the thick fur along his spine. She felt a sudden tremor run through his massive frame. The steady rhythm of his heart began to race erratically. The wolf let out a sudden, ragged breath. He tried to lift his head, but failed. The residual silver poison in his bloodstream flared to life. The violent transformation back to human form began against his will. His dark fur receded into pale, scarred skin. Eric collapsed, lacquered and exhausted, into the freezing stones. His golden eyes rolled back into his head. Clara screamed his name into the breaking dawn. The heavy sound of marching boots echoed from the broken gates. The royal army had finally arrived. Clara threw her torn cloak over the unconscious king. She stood alone between his vulnerable body and the approaching soldiers. The royal army poured through the broken gates. Hundreds of loyal soldiers marched into the snowy courtyard. Clara stood firmly over the unconscious king. She held her torn cloak tightly across his pale shoulders. The winter wind whipped her loose hair around her face. She raised her chin to meet the approaching force. A high-ranking captain rushed forward with a drawn sword. He stopped abruptly at the sight of the ruined courtyard. He saw the traitor Thorn weeping quietly in the snow. He saw the common baker guarding the fallen king. "Stay back," Clara ordered in a clear voice. Her tone surprised her with its steady authority. The captain hesitated and lowered his metal weapon. "We are his loyal guard, my lady," the soldier explained carefully. "The king needs a physician immediately," Clara stated. "Bring a stretcher, but no one draws a blade near him." The soldiers obeyed without a single word of protest. They recognized the fierce devotion in her bright eyes. They treated her simple commands as royal decrees. The trusted guards carried Eric into the east tower. They laid his heavy frame onto the large bed.
Clara dismissed the soldiers from the quiet chamber. She locked the heavy door from the inside. Only the royal physician remained to tend the lingering poison. The old man administered a bitter herbal draught. "The silver must burn its way out of his blood," the physician explained quietly. "He will suffer a terrible fever tonight." Clara nodded and thanked the wise man for his service. She escorted him out and secured the iron bolt again. She returned to the side of the great bed. She filled a ceramic basin with fresh water. She bathed his burning face with a damp cloth. The hours stretched into a silent vigil. Clara did not close her eyes for a single moment. She listened to his shallow breathing in the dark room. She remembered the first night in the freezing woods. He had been a dying beast then. Now he was her entire world. The fierce warlord looked surprisingly fragile in his sleep. His sharp features softened in the dim candlelight. Clara traced the edge of his healing scar. She whispered old stories to keep the silence away. She told him about her quiet village. She described the smell of fresh bread in the morning. She gave him pieces of her simple soul. The wind rattled the balcony glass outside the tower. The storm raged against the thick stone. A fragile peace reigned inside the warm chamber. The fire crackled softly in the stone hearth. Orange sparks danced up the dark chimney. Clara watched the shadows shift across his face. She wondered if the noble lords would accept a commoner. She quickly dismissed the foolish thought. Eric did not care for political approval. He wrote his own rules with steel and fire. Now she would have to learn to stand beside him. She possessed no royal blood in her veins. She only possessed a heart brave enough to love a monster. The fever finally broke just before dawn.
Eric let out a long, shuddering sigh. The unnatural heat left his pale skin. Clara dropped her tired head against the soft mattress. She kept her fingers laced tightly with his large hand. Exhaustion pulled her into a shallow sleep. Pale sunlight crept slowly across the thick rug. Eric opened his golden eyes to a quiet room. His vision blurred for a brief second. He felt a soft weight resting against his arm. He turned his head on the feather pillow. Clara slept peacefully beside his side. Her rhythmic breath washed warmly across his bare knuckles. Eric remembered the violent chaos of the courtyard. He remembered her small body shielding his fallen form. A profound emotion swelled inside his broad chest. It was a feeling foreign to a lonely king. It was pure, overwhelming gratitude. He shifted his weight carefully to avoid waking her. His subtle movement disturbed her light slumber anyway. Clara gasped and sat up straight. Her tired eyes searched his face for lingering pain. "You are awake," she breathed out in deep relief. Eric reached up to touch her bruised cheek. His rough thumb brushed away a stray tear. "You stayed with me," he murmured softly. "I will always stay with you," Clara promised without hesitation. Eric searched her face for any hidden fear. "I lost control in the snow," he confessed quietly. "I exposed my true nature to the entire court." "You saved my life," Clara corrected him gently. "You showed them the ultimate strength of a real king." Eric sat up slowly against the wooden headboard. He pulled her gently onto the edge of the mattress. "My enemies will never stop hunting me," he warned her. "This palace will always hide dangers in the dark shadows." "I am not afraid of the shadows anymore," Clara replied. She rested her small hand against his chest. "Not when I have a wolf to guard my door." Eric let out a quiet, rough laugh. The deep sound warmed the cold morning air. He framed her face with both hands. "I cannot offer you a simple life, Clara. I can only offer you everything I am. My armies, my vast lands, my loyal heart. They all belong to you now." Clara placed her hands over his scarred fingers. "I do not want your armies or your lands," she whispered. "I only want the man who carried my humble luggage." Eric leaned forward and rested his forehead against hers. He closed his eyes in a beautiful surrender. He breathed in the sweet scent of her skin. "You have him," he vowed into the quiet space, "for as long as the sun rises over the northern mountains." Clara tilted her head to bridge the final distance. She pressed her lips against his in a tender kiss. There was no desperate urgency in the gentle contact. It was a slow, silent promise of forever. Eric wrapped his strong arms around her waist. He pulled her carefully against his warm body. He handled her as if she were made of delicate glass. The ruthless tyrant found his true peace in the arms of a baker. The brutal world outside the tower walls no longer mattered. The political schemes of the southern lords faded into nothing. They were just a man and a woman in the morning light. "They will call you the Wolf Queen," Eric murmured against her lips. "A baker cannot be a preen," Clara teased softly. "A baker tamed the North?" Eric countered with a proud smile. "She conquered my kingdom with a single torn coat." Clara laughed, a bright, happy sound. The musical noise chased the last shadows from the grand room. She rested her head against his steady heartbeat. She knew she would never bake bread in her old village again. She had traded her quiet cabin for a fortress of stone. But she had also found the greatest warmth of her life. Eric stroked her dark hair with a gentle rhythm. He watched the winter sun climb higher in the pale sky. The long decade of war and fear was finally over. The Alpha King and his equal mate welcomed the new dawn together. And that is how a simple baker became the Wolf Queen. If Clara and Eric's journey touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button so you won't miss our next romance. I'm always curious, where in the world are you listening from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below and tell me how this story made you feel. See you in the next one!